Shalom. Welcome to Understanding Paul. We're about to begin lesson 3. So far, what we've covered is that what we're doing is we're going line by line through everything Paul wrote to show that there's no conflict between what Paul taught and the Torah. This is in response to those who reject Paul because they wrongly believe that he was antagonistic towards the Torah, and to those who reject the Torah because they believe Paul was antagonistic towards the Torah. So you have people on both sides. You have those who have rejected Paul because they wrongly believe he was antagonistic towards Torah, and those who have rejected Torah because they accept Paul and they believe wrongly that he was antagonistic towards the Torah. And the truth is, of course, that neither is the case. If Paul had been antagonistic towards the Torah, Deuteronomy 13 would have required us, before Paul was ever even born, to reject Paul or anyone else that would come along being antagonistic towards the Torah. So, what we're doing is we're seeking to understand what Paul actually said from the original Hebrew and Aramaic rather than from the Greek, and in terms of Jewish hermeneutics and in light of what we know about Second Temple era Judaism, both from the rabbinic literature and the Dead Sea Scrolls and sources such as Philo and Josephus. And so here we are. The initial argument that Paul laid out in Romans in the first opening chapters was a special kind of Midrash called a Yalamidenu homiletic Midrash, which is a Midrash literally means we have learned, or we shall learn. And it is a Midrash which in this case, it makes use of certain keywords in multiple texts to tie the texts together and use them to interpret one another. That's what this kind of Midrash does. In this particular, to teach us something, but in this particular case, it's a little more complicated than that. He also invokes the sixth rule of Hillel, which basically tells us that it's a rule of Jewish hermeneutics that basically tells us that if we see two passages that seem to conflict with one another, there's a third passage somewhere that resolves the conflict. It's very similar to a rule of hermeneutics that tells us that if we understand one passage in such a way that conflicts with another passage, we're misunderstanding one or both of them. And so Paul opens Romans with this conflict, and it's a conflict over how you define who is and is not a tzaddik, a righteous individual, versus a rasha. And interestingly, there's a strong parallel here between this and the opening here of Romans then, and the opening of the Tanya of the Rebbe Zalman, because the Tanya opens, the Tanya is the foundational work of the Chabad movement in Hasidic Judaism. The Tanya opens with the Rebbe Zalman taking two passages and showing an apparent contradiction between them concerning who and what, being a tzaddik or a righteous individual versus being a rasha. So it's also a rasha is a wicked man. So there are many, many parallels between Romans and the Tanya because both are dealing with essentially the same subject. The Beinoni, the man who is in the middle, the man who has the influence in his life of both the evil inclination, the Yetzer Ra, and the good inclination, the Yetzer Tov. And so there are many, many parallels between the two texts. And frankly, the Tanya is an amazing exploration of the same subject matter from a rabbinic perspective, and can help us understand Romans to a large extent. Okay, so last week we were talking about Romans 4 is where we left off, and Romans 4 actually is where Paul stops and expounds. He gets to the conclusion, the culmination of his initial argument. The passage that resolves the conflict is Genesis 15:6. The conflict is that he starts out with Habakkuk 2:4, the just shall live by faith. Then he quotes from the Psalms. The Psalm says, there's none righteous, not one. There's an apparent conflict. How can the righteous or the just live by faith if there's no such thing? And then there's two other passages that seem to conflict that he shows that there's one passage that says that Elohim shall judge each man according to his works. Another passage says that blessed is he whose unrighteous deeds are forgiven him. And again, there seems to be a conflict. How do we resolve the conflict? And that's where he comes to Genesis 15:6. Abraham believed and it was counted to him as righteousness. And then in chapter 4, he begins to thresh Genesis 15:6 for everything that we can learn from it. And that Genesis 15:6 tells us, in its context in the Torah, we can learn from it that Abraham was righteous before the Torah was given, that he was righteous before he was circumcised, though that righteousness led him ultimately to be circumcised, and so on. His and most important point is that his righteousness was apart from works. Now this is important because it is a key to Paul's teaching, and it's very, very rabbinic, Talmudic concept. It is the teaching of Antigonus of Soko that we read in the Mishnah in Avot, in the Mishnah in Avot 1:3. His teaching was that we do not keep the Torah as one who is seeking to earn a reward, but as one who has no mind of a reward, and let the fear of heaven be upon you, the awe of Elohim, in other words. And so Antigonus's point is that we are not trying to earn anything in our Torah observance. Therefore, we're not trying to earn salvation. We're not trying to earn righteousness. Righteousness is not something that we can earn via Torah observance. And so that's a key point in the argument. So in Romans 4, a key point that Paul makes is that Abraham was made righteous and was righteous because of his faith, not because of his works, in Genesis 15:6. Some people think that this conflicts with the teaching of James the Just in James or Yaakov 2:24, where he says, you see then how that by works a man is justified and not by faith only. However, the problem here is that the word tzadikah, okay, righteousness, can in fact be is ambiguous. It can mean many things. It can be used as a synonym for salvation, and it can, as it is in Psalm 71:15, where it's used in poetic parallelism. In poetic parallelism is a synonym for Yeshua, for salvation. That's Psalm 71:15. However, it can also be used to indicate, as is in Isaiah 32:17, works of righteousness, an outer display of righteousness. So these are two different meanings of the word. James the Just, in chapter 2, verse 18, Yaakov HaTzadik, in his letter, he cites specifically the example of Abraham offering up Yitzhak in Genesis, which takes place in Genesis 22. Now you may notice that Genesis 22 takes place after Genesis 15. Okay, and so what? And Yaakov specifically says that he's talking about an outer display of righteousness. I will show you my faith by my works. So they're using the word to mean two different things. To the contrary, in fact, Paul makes the point in Romans chapter 4 that Abraham's faith, he says in verse 11, for he received circumcision, the sign and the seal of the righteousness of his trust or his faith from the uncircumcision, that it might be reckoned also to them for righteousness. Then he talks about, verse 12, those who follow in the footsteps of the faith of the uncircumcision of our father Abraham. Those footsteps were that in his uncircumcision he was made righteous, and then he was reckoned as righteous in Genesis 15, and then in Genesis 17 he received circumcision as a sign and seal of the righteousness of his faith. Okay, this is Paul. Okay, and then later on it says in verse 19, and he was not weak in his faith concerning his dead body, that he was 100 years old in the dead womb of Sarah. He did not doubt the promise of Eloah as one lacking faith or trust, but was strong in trust and gave praise to Elohim. That's in Genesis 18, after his circumcision. And then in Yaakov HaTzadik's argument, he cites Genesis 22, which is even after that. So by that time, Abraham has been reckoned as righteous by his faith. He has, as a sign and seal of the righteousness of his faith, received circumcision in Genesis 17. He has in Genesis 18 demonstrated the unwaveringness of his faith, of his emunah, in believing the promise of Elohim that Sarah would give birth to a son. And in Genesis 22, he showed his righteousness and his faith by his works, which were inspired by his emunah, when he offered up Yitzhak. Okay, so I just wanted to make that point. There's no conflict between what Yaakov HaTzadik taught and what Paul taught in Romans chapter 4. Moving on now, we said we were going to pick up today in Romans chapter 5. And remember, we're still learning from Genesis 15:6. The next ramification Paul wants to learn from Genesis 15:6 really comes from the Targum. And if you don't know the Targum, then you don't realize this. So it just seems like Paul in chapter 5 just suddenly pops up with something. But if you know the Targum, you know that the Targum to Genesis 15:6 says that Abraham believed in the word of Yahweh, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And what is the word of Yahweh? The Messiah is the word of Yahweh. There's a whole teaching on that, but clearly it can be shown that Philo made that identification. Paul made that identification, and that identification is clearly made in the first few chapters of the book of John or Yochanan, the Word and the Messiah. And that's key because the Tanya has to do with the Torah being internalized, the Word being internalized, and identifies the Word with the Son. And if you understand who that really is, then you can realize that the Tanya and Romans are saying the same thing. Okay, chapter 5, verse 1. Therefore, because we are justified by trust or faith, we have shalom towards Elohim, our Adon Yeshua the Messiah, that by him we were brought by trust to his favor, by which we stand and boast of the hope of the glory of Eloah. And not only so, but also we boast by our afflictions, because we know that affliction completes patience in us. And patience experience, and experience hope. And hope does not put to shame, because the love of Eloah is poured out upon our hearts by the Ruach HaKodesh that was given to us. What is the Ruach HaKodesh? It's a spark of the divine. This is just the same thing that the Tanya is saying. The Tanya talks about how the person who receives the Torah, who takes the wisdom of the Torah, and the Torah then becomes gestates in their understanding and gives birth to a knowledge of the Torah within them. Then they have the Torah in their inward parts, that constitutes a second soul within them that is corresponds with the Son, and with a second spirit, which is a second soul, which is the spark of the divine. And when we look at the Zohar, we see clearly that second soul is also referred to as a spirit. Okay, now the Messiah, because of our wickedness, died at this time for the wicked. But scarcely does a man die for the wicked. Now the word wicked here in the Greek is righteous. So in the Greek it says, for scarcely does a man die for the righteous. Obviously, many people, there are a number of people that would be willing to die for a tzaddik. There are far fewer people that would be willing to die for a rasha, a wicked man. And that's the whole point that Paul is making here, is that Mashiach was willing to die for us even when we were still a rasha. Though for the good, perhaps a man might dare to die. Herein Eloah has manifest his love that towards us, because if while we were sinners, the Messiah died for us. Then how much more exceedingly will we be justified now by his blood and be saved from him from wrath? For if when we were enemies, Eloah has reconciled with us by the death of his Son, then how much more exceedingly shall we, by his reconciliation, live by his life? This is a kol vechomer argument. This is he's using the first rule of Hillel, which is light and heavy. It's an argument that says if X is true of Y, it must so much more be true of Z, because Z is of even greater weight of Y. Okay, so here he's again using the 7 rules of Hillel. And now, not only this also, but we boost in Eloah by the hand of our Adon Yeshua the Messiah, by whom we have now received reconciliation. For as through one Son of Man, now you have to understand the word Son of Man here is actually an Aramaic idiom meaning a mortal, a human being, a person. For as though one Son of Man entered the world, it's talking about Adam. Adam was definitely not a son of man in the literal sense, but idiomatically he was a son of man in that he was a mortal. He was a human being. For as through one Son of Man sin entered the world, and through sin death, even so on all sons of men death passed, in that all of them have sinned. And that this is what it means when it says there's none righteous, not one. Why? Because we all have something called the Yetzer Ra. And we inherited the Yetzer Ra. We're born with it. We inherited the Yetzer Ra. It is tied to the animal soul. And we were born with it. And the Yetzer Ra goes back to Adam. Okay, we'll talk more about this in a moment because it's a key point. Just like the Tanya does go into the conflict between the Yetzer Ra and the Yetzer Tov, and the fact that this second soul within us, this spark of the divine, helps the Yetzer Tov overcome the Yetzer Ra. Paul is going to make the same point because Paul and Tanya are teaching the same thing. Yet somehow people think Paul is anti-Judaic. Don't ask me how, okay? Because Paul and the Tanya are singing the same song together in harmony. Verse 13, for until the Torah, sin, although it was in the world, was not counted as sin because there was no Torah. But death reigned from Adam, even unto Moshe, even over those who had not sinned in the likeness of the transgression of the Torah of Adam, who was the likeness of the Yetzer Ra, the inclination to do evil. Even though the Torah hadn't been given yet, we still knew that right from wrong, and we still had the Yetzer Ra inclining us to do evil. Okay, what we're reading about here is the birth of the Yetzer Ra. Let's go ahead and keep going. But the offense was also not as the gift, for if because of the offense of one many died, how much more therefore the favor of Eloah and his gift, because of the one Son of Man, Yeshua the Messiah, shall be made to abound in many. And the error of one also was not as the gift, for the judgment was from one caused condemnation, but the gift caused righteousness from many sins. For if because of the error of one death reigned, much more those who receive the abundance of favor and the gift of righteousness will reign in life by the way of the one Yeshua the Messiah. Likewise, therefore, because of the error of one, speaking of Adam, condemnation was to all men, so also because of the righteousness of one, the victory unto life would be to all sons of men. For likewise, because of the disobedience of one son of man, literally, not literally son of man, but idiomatically, Adam, a human being, many became sinners, so also because of the obedience of one, many became righteous ones, tzaddikim, but the entrance was, now this is a key verse that the Greek has really mangled. I'm translating literally from the Aramaic here. But the entrance that was towards the Torah was because that sin might have proliferated, and where sin proliferates, there grace abounds. Okay, this in the Aramaic then, chesed, grace, and Torah are not contrasted with one another. They are brought together. There was a need for Torah because there was a need for grace, because sin was abounding, and the fact that sin was abounding brought about a need for Torah by Elohim's chesed, his undue favor. He gave us the Torah. So, verse 21, for as sin reigned by death, also grace will reign in righteousness unto eternal life by the hand of our Adon, Yeshua the Messiah. There is a debate that takes place in the Talmud, in Sukkot 52a, between Rabbi Dosa and the other rabbis, the majority. And in this debate, and it's kind of interesting because this is actually, as I recall, this is part of a Gemara that's expounding upon a Mishnah that discusses the Mishnah discusses the great light. There was a great huge menorah that was up during Sukkah, because Sukkah was the original festival of lights. Hanukkah the original Hanukkah was a belated Sukkot, and so that's how Hanukkah became the festival of lights. Sukkah was the original festival of lights. So there was this big 75-foot menorah with these bonfires on top of it, which Yeshua was standing in front of, no doubt, when he says during Sukkot, around Yochanan chapter 8, I believe, I am the light of the world. You have to understand that there was this big light behind him. It is interesting that it is in the Gemara to this passage, in Sukkot 52a, that Rabbi Dosa is having a debate with the majority of the rabbis over what causes the mourning that is mentioned, the lamentation, in other words, that is mentioned in Zechariah 12:12. And according to Rabbi Dosa, it is the death of the Messiah ben Yosef. That's the suffering servant Messiah, the Messiah ben Yosef. And in Zechariah 12:10, where it says, they will look upon me whom they have pierced and they shall mourn. So he says it's talking about the Messiah ben Yosef. And he has the Targum to Zechariah 12:10 on his side, because the Targum to Zechariah 12:10 also says that this is Messiah this is Messiah ben Ephraim or Messiah ben Yosef. I don't recall, but it makes the same identification. And so this is Rabbi Dosa's position. And the majority say, no, they're mourning for the death of the Yitzhak, the evil inclination. And the Talmud then goes into why they would mourn for the death of the evil inclination and so on. But the actual truth, I believe, is that the Yitzhak, that they're both right. That in fact, the death of the Messiah ben Yosef is the key to the destruction, ultimate destruction of the Yitzhak, and brings about the ultimate destruction of the Yitzhak. And so, and I think there's implications even in the debate that take place in Sukkot 52a, because it goes in talking about Messiah ben David and so on. that in fact they're not. It's not either or. It's actually both. And so the death of the Messiah. Remember now, however, the Messiah, according to Revelation, is the Lamb that was slain from the foundations of the earth, and so that death has an impact through all time. So, as we read in Romans chapter 5, we read about the Yetzer Ra, and how the Yetzer Ra, we have the Yetzer Ra and the Yetzer Tov. In fact, in the Talmud, in Bereshit 61, sorry, that's one of the books of the Torah, Bereshit 61a, and B, there's a discussion about the Yetzer Ra and the Yetzer Tov. We won't get into it right now, but there is a discussion about, if you want to study more about the Yetzer Ra and the Yetzer Tov. The Yetzer Ra, the birth of the Yetzer Ra through Adam, is talked about in 2nd Esdras. 2nd Esdras is in the Apocrypha. It's one of the books that, the Apocrypha are the books that were in the Septuagint, and they were in the Peshitta version of the Tanakh, and there's tremendous amount of evidence that they were accepted and used by the Nazarenes in ancient times. But they didn't make it into the Masoretic text, and so they're not part of many Bibles today. Okay, they are in the Apocrypha. Some Bibles have an appendix. The original King James Version had an appendix, and I do have to let you know about 2nd Esdras. The Latin version of 2nd Esdras differs from all the other versions, the Aramaic and the Arabic version of 2nd Esdras. The original Hebrew has been lost, but the Aramaic version does not contain the first 2 chapters or the last 2 chapters. Those do appear in the Latin. There's good evidence to indicate that the monks monkeyed with the text and added 2 chapters to the beginning and ending. So I don't believe the first 2 chapters or the last 2 chapters really belong. However, we are going to be looking at chapter 3, which was originally chapter 1, if you will. And we're going to look at what it says about Adam and the birth of the Yetzer Ra in chapter 3, verses 21 through 27. It says, "For the first Adam burned with an evil heart, transgressed and was overcome, as were also all who were descended from him. Thus the disease became permanent," the Yetzer Ra. "The Torah was in people's heart along with the evil root," the Yetzer Ra. "But what was good departed, and the evil remained. So the times passed, and the years completed, and you did raise up for yourself a servant named David. And you did command him to build a city for your name, and in it to offer 3 oblations from what is yours. This was done for many years, but the inhabitants of the city transgressed, in everything doing as Adam and his descendants had done, for they also had the evil inclination," or the evil heart, "for you did deliver the city into the hands of your enemies." So here we also read about the evil inclination going back to Adam. What's the resolution to the evil inclination? Well, the resolution to the evil inclination, according to Romans chapter 5, is the Ruach HaKodesh in verse 5 that we receive because of the Messiah, and is tied to the death of the Mashiach. It's very interesting that this also ties, if you go back to Romans chapter 2, verse 29, to the circumcision that is of the heart. But that one is a Jew who is one secretly in circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, and not by the letter only, whose praise is not from men, but from Eloah. Okay, so the Ruach, the second soul, the spark of the divine within us, is able to be within us because of the death of the Messiah. And let me read what, interestingly, Ramban, one of the great rabbinic commentators, says concerning the circumcision of the heart, because that's actually a reference to Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 6. So let's see what Ramban says, and I think you'll find it very interesting because it could almost be pulled right out of Romans. Ramban says, "And Yahweh your Elohim will circumcise your heart." Deuteronomy 36. "It is this which the rabbis have said. If someone comes to purify himself, they assist him from on high. This verse assures you that you will return to him with all your heart. If you will return to him with all your heart, he will help you." This following subject is very apparent from Scripture. Since the time of creation, man has had the power to do as he pleased, to be righteous or wicked. This grant of free will applies likewise to the entire Torah period, so that people can gain merit upon choosing the good and punishment for preferring evil. But in the days of the Mashiach, the choice of their genuine good will be natural. The heart will not desire the improper, and it will have no craving whatever for it. This is the circumcision mentioned here, for lust and desire are the foreskin of the heart, and the circumcision of the heart means that it will not covet or desire evil. Man will return at that time to what he was before the sin of Adam. This is right in line with Romans chapter 5. When by his nature he did what should properly be done, and there was no conflicting desires in his will, as I have explained in Seder Bereshit. It is this which Scripture states in the book of Jeremiah 31:30, "Behold, the days come, says Yahweh, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers," etc., "but this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Eternal. I will put my Torah in their inward parts." This is what Tanya chapter 5 is really about. "And in their heart I will write it." This is a reference to the annulment of the evil inclination and to the natural performance by the heart of its proper function. Therefore Jeremiah said further, "I will be their Elohim, and they shall be my people, and they shall teach no more every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know Yahweh, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them. Now it is known that the imagination of a man's heart is evil from his youth, and it is necessary to instruct them. But at that time it will not be necessary to instruct them, for their evil inclination will then be completely abolished. And so it is declared by Ezekiel, a new heart I will give you, and a new spirit I will put within you, and I will cause you to walk in my statutes. Ezekiel 36:26. The new heart alludes to man's nature, and the new spirit is the desire and will. It is this which our rabbis have said, and the years draw near, when you shall say, I have no pleasure in them, for these are the days of Messiah, as they will offer opportunity neither for merit nor for guilt. For in the days of the Messiah there will be no evil desire in man, but he will naturally perform the proper deeds, and therefore there will be neither merit nor guilt in them, for merit and guilt are dependent upon desire. That's the Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, who lived in the 12th century. Well, the late 12th century. He wrote in the 13th century. And it's his commentary on Deuteronomy 29:6, talking about the circumcision of the heart. So there, Romans 5 and Ramban on the circumcision of the heart just go totally hand in hand. Yet somehow people walk away thinking that there's some conflict between what Paul is teaching and what Judaism teaches. And again, that is absolutely incomprehensible to me. Okay, Romans chapter 6. Romans chapter 6, Paul poses a new problem question, if you will. He returns to the issue of people misunderstanding what he's saying, because in chapter 4 and chapter 5 he has said a great deal, and as we said, Paul doesn't want his words to be misinterpreted like those of Antigonus of Soko. See, Antigonus of Soko was misinterpreted. Antigonus of Soko said that we don't keep the Torah like one who is trying to earn a reward, but as one who has no mind of a reward. And so one of his students, named Sadiq, said, well, that meant that that must mean that there is no reward. That means that there is no afterlife. And the Sadducean sect was born that taught that there's no resurrection and no afterlife. All as a result of misunderstanding the teaching of Antigonus of Soko. Paul's teaching, Antigonus of Soko, by the way, was the leader of the first Hasidic revival that took place during the days of the Maccabees. His teaching was chesed, it was grace, it was undue favor. It was saying we're not trying to earn anything by Torah observance. We keep Torah for its own merits. Why do we keep Torah? We keep Torah to cleave to Elohim because it brings us closer to Him. It's an expression of the mind of Elohim, and it brings our mind into alignment with His mind, and brings ourselves into alignment with Him. There's a tremendous beauty there, and so on. But we don't keep Torah as like it's some kind of bribe to Elohim to give us a place in the world to come. Our place in the world to come, therefore, is as a result of chesed, undue favor. Okay, and that was the basis of Antigonus of Soko's teaching, Hasidism, and it was the teaching of Paul as well. Interestingly, just as the misunderstanding of Antigonus's teaching led to the creation of an apostate sect, the misunderstanding of Paul's teaching by Gentile Christians, antinomian Christians, led to the creation of antinomian Christianity. So there's a parallel between this Zadik, who was the founder of the Zaddikim, the Sadducees, and Ignatius of Antioch, who likewise misunderstood the teachings of Paul. He wasn't the first one, though. Many misunderstood Paul, as Paul says, "What then shall we say?" Verse 6, chapter 6, verse 1. What then shall we say? Paul's going to propose, pose the question, why do we keep Torah? Should we keep Torah then? Why bother? If we're saved by grace through faith, and not of works, and so on, then why do we observe Torah? What then shall we say? Should we continue in sin that grace, chesed, might abound? In other words, hey, the more we sin, the more undue favor Elohim is giving us when He saves us anyway, quote unquote. If that's what you think, if that's what you're teaching, it's not what he's teaching. It's important to understand that it's not what Paul is saying, but he's throwing this out there. And what is sin, by the way? 1 John 1:34, I believe, or 1 John 3:4, says that sin is the transgression of the Torah. So we could say, what shall we say? Should we continue to transgress the Torah that chesed might abound, that grace might abound? But what is his answer in verse 2? Chas. We talked about the word chas last week. Absolutely not. Certainly not. For we are they who are dead to sin. How may we live in it again? Okay, so if our Yitzer Ra is really dead. Now let's back up. I wanted to mention something here in chapter 5. In chapter 5, verses 8 through 10, it's very clear that there's a two-stage process here in the death of the Yitzer Ra, the destruction of the Yitzer Ra by the death of the Messiah. For herein Elohim has manifested His love that is towards us, because if while we were sinners the Messiah died for us, how much more exceedingly will we be justified now by His blood and be saved by Him from wrath. So we're justified now we're counted and reckoned as righteous now by our emunah, but then when we will be saved by him in the resurrection, because our Yetzer Ra will not be resurrected with us. The Yetzer Ra will be destroyed. For if when we were enemies, Eloah has reconciled with us by the death of his Son, then how much more exceedingly shall we, by his reconciliation, live by his life? So now we are reckoned as righteous by our faith, but then not only will we have the power to overcome the Yetzer Ra within us through the Ruach, the spirit within us, the second soul within us, the spark of the divine within us that aids our inclination to do good and helps us overcome the inclination to do evil. But then the inclination to do evil after death, our death, is not resurrected with us. So in the resurrection we will have only the inclination to do good, and so it will come naturally to us to do good. Right now we're still a Benoni. We still have both voices, but we have the Ruach giving a little amplification to the inclination to do good. So that our inclination to do good has the power to overcome the inclination to do evil. Okay. Or do we not know, chapter 6, verse 3. For do you not know that we who are immersed in Yeshua the Messiah are immersed onto his death? We are buried with him in immersion to death, that as Yeshua the Messiah arose from among the dead in the glory of the Father, so also we will walk in renewed life. So in other words, the immersion is a symbol of the death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah, and our own death, burial, and resurrection after our immersion, if you will, okay, as a result of our allegorical immersion with the Messiah, we receive the Ruach HaKodesh and have the ability to overcome evil, okay? But in the ultimate, actual resurrection, we won't have a Yetzer Ra. We'll only have a Yetzer Tov. We won't have an animal soul. We'll only have the divine soul. For if we were planted together with him in the likeness of his death, so we will also be in his resurrection. For we know that our old son of man, that's the animal soul, the Yetzer Ra, was crucified with him, that the body of sin might be annulled, so that we should no longer serve sin, serve the Yetzer Ra. For he who is dead is free from sin. If you were dead with the Messiah, he should believe that with the same Messiah we should live. For we know that the Messiah arose from among the dead and will not die again, and death does not have rule over him. For in dying to sin, he died once, and in living, he lives in Eloah. Likewise also, you count your nefeshot, your soul, that you are dead to sin and alive in Eloah through the Adon Yeshua the Messiah. In other words, you're dead to the Yetzer Ra. But alive to the Yetzer Tov and to the divine soul. Therefore, let not sin reign in your dead body. Don't listen to the Yetzer Ra. Don't let the Yetzer Ra boss you around, so that you obey its lusts. Okay, so stop listening to the Yetzer Ra. It's not your master anymore. And also, do not present your members as an instrument of iniquity for sin, but present your nefeshot to Eloah as men who have life from the dead, and let your members be an instrument for the righteousness of Eloah. And sin will not rule over you, for you are not under the law, but under favor. What does under the law mean? Or to keep namosa, it says in the Aramaic. Under the law was a technical theological phrase used by Paul's enemies, his adversaries. Okay, it was a term used by the radical Essene hyper-purist groups. These believed that they could just purify their way to righteousness. They also used the term works of the law, referring to a series of there's actually a document that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We will talk so much about this when we get to Galatians. Paul just touches on it in Romans, so we're touching on it now. When we get to Galatians, we're going to talk in depth about this. But under the law is not an obsolete Old Testament system. Under the law is a false theology that was never true. It does not mean the same thing as the sum of the words under the law, just as works of the law, when Paul uses it, does not mean the same thing as the sum of the phrase works of the law, the sum of the words. Works of the law was a technical theological term used by his opponents. Under the law was also a technical theological term used by his opponents. In fact, in chapter 7, verse 12, talking about the Torah, he says, the Torah therefore is set apart or holy, and the commandment is set apart or holy, righteous, and good. Nothing wrong with the Torah. Okay. But the under the law teaching was a false theology that was never true. The works of the law teaching was a false theology that was never true. They're not obsolete Old Testament systems of salvation. They're false theologies that were never true. That's why we read in verse 14, and sin will not rule over you, for you are not under the law, but under grace or under favor. The two are antithetic to one another. You can't be both, according to Paul here. You're either under the law or under grace. We've always been under undue favor. We've always been under grace. No, because no man could ever earn his salvation. That means nobody was earning their salvation in Old Testament times. That means we were under grace, and in fact the word grace appears throughout the Torah and the Tanakh to refer to Israel as being under grace. Okay, so we've always been under grace. We've never been under the law. We've never been saved. We never earned salvation. We were never being saved by Torah observance. That brings us to verse 15, where Paul proposes yet another misunderstanding of his teaching, and he again rebuts it. After showing us in the previous part of Romans here that our Yitzer Ra dies with the Mashiach, it doesn't literally die. That happens when we actually die, but it allegorically dies in that we have the power through the Ruach to ignore it. We don't always succeed in doing that, but we have the ability to do that with the Ruach. Verse 15, what then should we sin because we are not under the law, but under favor? So, if we're not under the law and we're under favor, should we continue to sin? Should we continue to transgress the Torah? Remember, sin, 1 John 3:4, is transgression of the Torah. So should we continue to transgress the Torah that grace might abound? Gentile Christianity, antinomian Christianity says yes. That's their misunderstanding of Paul. Does Paul say? Chas, absolutely not. And he goes on to explain what he's really saying. He says, do you not know that to whom you present your nephesh for service, you must obey? You are the servants of that one whom you obey, whether to sin or to the obedience of righteousness. So, you're either a servant of the Yitzer Ra or the Yitzer Tov. You choose which one you want to be a servant to. Okay? But thanks be to Eloah, because you were servants of sin, but now you have obeyed from the heart the form of teaching to which you are committed. And when you were freed from sin, freed from the Yitzer Ra, you were made subject to righteousness. In other words, if you continue to sin, that grace might abound, it means that you're really not listening to the Yitzer Ra. You really don't have the Ruach. You're really not following the Yitzer Tov, the good inclination. If you're following the Yitzer Ra, then you're following the Yitzer Ra. You're not, this hasn't happened to you. In other words, there's a natural result that happens from receiving the Mashiach, which is the incarnation of the Torah. When you receive the Torah into your heart, when wisdom of Torah gestates in your understanding and becomes a knowledge of Torah within you, then the Son is born within you. You receive a second soul. This is what the Tanya teaches. You receive a second soul, a spark of the divine within you. Paul calls it the Ruach HaKodesh. You receive this Ruach within you. The Zohar makes the same identification. You receive this Ruach within you, and then your natural inclination favors the Yetzer Tov instead of the Yetzer Ra. I speak as among the sons of men because of the weakness of your flesh, that thus as you present your members for the service of uncleanness and iniquity, thus also now present your members for the service of righteousness and holiness. In other words, Paul is saying the same thing as the Tanya. He's saying the same thing as Antigonus Sissoko. He's saying the same thing as Hasidism. He's saying we're not observing the Torah because we're trying to earn anything. We are observing the Torah because it's the natural result of following the Yetzer Tov, which is the natural result of having received the Torah in our hearts and having a circumcised heart. For when you were servants of sin, you were free from righteousness. And what kind of fruit did you have at that time, or which today you are ashamed? For its end is death. And now that you have been freed from sin and you are servants of Eloah, you have set apart fruit whose end is life eternal. For the wages of sin is death, and the gift of Eloah is life eternal by our Adon Yeshua the Messiah. Thus we end chapter 6. So in chapter 6, Paul makes two arguments. In the first 14 verses, he argues that our Yetzer Ra allegorically dies with the Mashiach and literally dies with our death. And in verses 15 through 23, he says, therefore, our new master is the Yetzer Tov, the inclination to do good, so we don't follow the Yetzer Ra anymore. So, no, we don't continue to sin that grace might abound, despite the fact that we are saved by grace through faith, despite the fact that it's a matter of undue favor, that Abraham was counted as righteous before, by his emunah, his faith, before he was circumcised, before he demonstrated his belief in Genesis 18, and before he demonstrated his belief in Genesis 22. Likewise, our faith is going to show within us as we then give greater inclination, have the divine soul within us and greater inclination to the Yetzer Tov, and we're able to overcome the Yetzer Ra. We are not inclined. We want to keep Torah. We want to study Torah. We want to learn Torah. We want to make Torah a part of our lives because that's the mind of Elohim, and we want to cleave onto Elohim and have unity with him. Okay? And so that's the end of Romans chapter 6, and that's the end of our study today. I hope that you will join us again for understanding Paul as we begin in Romans chapter 7. Until then, shalom.